My wife bought new $2 million villa for her and her lover, Pleasure, and this, how I figure it out. The call from my lawyer came in at 2:17 on a Tuesday that felt like any other. Mr. Walker, this is Dana from Crestview Realty. I just wanted to personally congratulate you and your wife on the accepted offer for the property on Brookstone Hills. We're very excited to move ahead as soon as we receive confirmation on the remaining wire transfer, she said, all in one clean breath. And my brain tripped over every word after congratulate, because there was no property on Brookstone Hills in my life, no offer I'd made, no wire I knew about, and yet she said it all as if she were talking about a package that had already shipped and was just waiting to be signed for. For a second, I thought maybe it was just a wrong number, some other walker out there with better luck and more money. But then she mentioned my email address, the one I use for bank stuff, and she rattled off the last 4 digits of my social. And my chair seemed to lean back all on its own, like my body needed distance from the sound of my own details rolling out of the mouth of a stranger, and I heard my voice come out a little too calm as I told her I had no idea what she was talking about, and she must have the wrong man. There was a pause on her end, a small rustle of paper or keyboard sounds, and then she said, still cheerful but with a new edge, I have a Daniel and Emma Walker, joint buyers, 2.185 million cash purchase, primary contact Emma, secondary Daniel, all documents executed, inspection waived, closing set for the 15th, and every word after Emma landed like a punch. Because if there was one person on this planet whose name you never expect to hear in a conversation about secret mansions and massive wire transfers, it's your own wife's. I asked her to email me the documents. I think I even apologized for the inconvenience, because you don't stop being polite in an instant just because your life has started quietly cracking. And when I hung up, I sat there at my desk with my phone still in my hand, staring at the gray fabric wall of my cubicle, at the faded motivational poster about teamwork that had been there since I started 3 years ago, and it hit me in this weird sideways way that I was probably looking at that poster for the last time as the same man who had walked into this office in the morning. When the email arrived, the subject line contained a street address I didn't recognize and a string of numbers that might as well have been coordinates to the place where my old life was about to be buried, and I opened the attachments with this slow, heavy feeling in my chest, like I already knew what I was going to see. Page after page of clean, official language about purchase price and escrow and title, my name neatly typed in all the right places, and then the digital signature blocks, those squiggly approximations of handwriting that we all pretend are the same as the real thing. Except I knew right away that this particular squiggle wasn't mine, because I could not remember ever agreeing to buy a mansion. And I like to think I'd remember a $2 million impulse purchase. I clicked through to the financials, to the proof of funds, to the bank statements, and that's when the bottom dropped out because I saw my investment account listed there, the one I rarely logged into anymore since Emma had taken over most of the bills and long-term planning. Balance neatly reduced by a series of transfers with dates that suddenly lined up with weekends she'd said she was going to look at places for fun, and a kind of slow, icy anger started to bloom under my ribs, pushing aside the shock just enough to let me think clearly enough to scroll back and check the contact section again. I forwarded it all to my personal email, shut my work laptop without really knowing why, and walked out of the office without saying a word to anyone, my legs carrying me down the hall and into the elevator on pure instinct, while my mind replayed 8.5 years of marriage like a movie on fast forward, stopping briefly at every late night she'd stayed at yoga, every weekend away with friends, every moment she'd looked at her phone a little too quickly when a notification buzzed, every time I'd felt a small twinge of doubt and smothered it with trust, because that's what you're supposed to do when you love someone. By the time I got to the parking lot, my hands were shaking, but I unlocked the car and sat in the driver's seat staring straight ahead, watching other people walk to their cars and laugh into their phones and load kids into car seats, lives going on as if the universe hadn't just politely informed me that my wife had bought a mansion without telling me. And I remember thinking, in this weird, detached way, that if I drove straight to the address from the email and parked outside, I'd probably see some realtor's sign with the word "sold" on it. And my name would be buried in the paperwork inside, as invisible to the world as my confusion felt right then. The drive home was mostly a blur of red lights and tail lights and the kind of half-aware lane changes you only survive because other people on the road are paying more attention than you are. And when I turned onto our street, it hit me how small our house suddenly looked in my eyes. The modest 3-bedroom we'd painted and patched and upgraded over the years, the place that had always represented progress and security and togetherness, now feeling like the starter home she'd been quietly trading up from while I sat on the couch with a beer and trusted her. Emma was at the kitchen island when I walked in, laptop open, glasses on, a mug of tea leaving a ring on a coaster she'd bought on some weekend trip, and she looked up with this automatic smile that barely reached her eyes, the married people smile that means, hey, you're home, life is normal. and she said, "Hey, you're back early. Everything okay at work?" in this casual tone that made my skin crawl because I was already seeing everything differently, like someone had adjusted the focus on the whole room. I set my keys down a little too hard in the bowl by the door, pulled my phone from my pocket, opened the email, and walked over to her, placing the screen between us on the granite like a piece of evidence in a trial neither of us had known we were in until that moment. And I said, "I got an interesting call today about a house in Brookstone Hills that I apparently bought, so I thought maybe you could tell me what the hell is going on." And as the words left my mouth, the air in the room seemed to thicken, like the house had been holding its breath for years and finally let it out. She went still, every muscle tightening just a hair. Then she turned her eyes down to the screen, scanned the header, the address, the numbers, and I watched a tiny flinch cross her face when she hit the signature line, the part where my forged consent stared back at both of us, and she took a slow breath in and said, "Okay, Daniel, just let me explain this before you go crazy about it, please." Which is something people say when they already know there's no good way to arrange the facts, only less terrible ones. Her explanation started with words like investment and opportunity and timing, how the market in that neighborhood was moving fast, and how she'd been talking to this realtor about options for months, how she'd meant to bring it up properly but wanted to make sure it was real first, and then how one thing had led to another, and the deal had moved quicker than she expected. And there had been a deadline, and she hadn't wanted to bother me at work, and the bank had insisted both names be on the paperwork, and she honestly thought she could handle it, and surprise me with a done deal that would make us both proud. She said, "us," a lot. And we, and our future. And every time she did, it felt like someone scraping a fork across a plate, because the pages I just read were all about her moving in secret, not in partnership. And when I asked her how she had gotten my digital signature on documents I'd never seen, she hesitated just long enough to make the answer pointless, then admitted she'd used a saved signature file from one of our mortgage refinances, that she hadn't thought it was a big deal, that it was just a formality. But formality doesn't drain hundreds of thousands of dollars from your accounts, and when I pushed her about the money, she shifted from the grand language of investment to the smaller, sharper words of blame and division, reminding me of how much she'd put in too, how hard she'd worked, how often I'd left the finances to her because I didn't want to deal with them, as if my laziness made her secret, spending something like a favor she was doing for both of us. I could tell I was only circling the real problem, though, circling it like a drain. And I got there when I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, "So who went to see this place with you, Emma, because I know you, and you're not the type to walk into a $2 million house alone, sign papers, and just hope for the best. Someone held your hand through this, and I want to know who." And the way her eyes slid away from mine then, just a fraction, told me more than any words were going to. She tried to dodge first, said she'd gone with the realtor a few times, that the inspector had been there, that it wasn't like she was doing anything shady, but when I kept staring and didn't blink and didn't back off, she finally said, almost under her breath, "Luke came with me a couple of times. He knows construction. He was helping me see what needed doing." And for a second I just stood there repeating the name in my head, trying to connect it to someone, and then I saw him clear as day, the contractor who had redone our kitchen last year, the guy with the easy grin and the strong forearms and the habit of calling me man in this easy, flattering way that made me feel like we were on the same team. "Luke," I said out loud, testing how it felt in my mouth now, and then I asked the question that had been forming in the back of my mind since the call from the realtor, the one I didn't want to ask but couldn't not ask. "Are you sleeping with him?" And there was this tiny moment where everything in the room just held still, like the universe was giving her one last chance to say no, to laugh, to be offended, to surprise me, and she blew it because she looked down and said, "It's not that simple, Daniel." Which is how people say yes when they're not ready to admit it. The rest of that conversation was less like a fight and more like a long, slow car crash. She talked about feeling lonely, about me being distant, about the night she and Luke had stayed late after a job and had a few drinks, and one thing led to another, and I listened with this weird double awareness, half of me registering the content, each detail another jagged piece of glass, and the other half noticing stupid things, like how the light above the stove flickered every few seconds, and how her tea had gone cold, and how my hands looked older than I remembered when I gripped the back of the chair to keep them from shaking. By the time we ran out of words, the sky outside had gone from afternoon bright to that flat gray evening light that makes everything look a little washed out, and the kitchen, which had always been the center of our shared life, looked like a crime scene with no visible blood, just 1,000 tiny clues that something precious had been broken beyond repair while I wasn't looking. We didn't decide anything big that night. There was no slammed door or suitcase thrown down the stairs, no sudden, dramatic announcement of divorce, just a tired agreement that I would sleep in the guest room and we'd talk again when we'd both calmed down. Which turned out to be wishful thinking because there was no calm to be found in that house anymore. Just pockets of anger and shame and fear wearing different faces depending on which room you were in. In the guest room, lying on a mattress we'd always meant to upgrade but never did. Because there were always more urgent expenses. I stared at the ceiling and thought about how quickly a life can shift from ordinary to unrecognizable. How in the space of a single phone call and a handful of documents, I'd gone from a man with a wife and a plan to someone occupying a spare bed in his own home, like a long-term guest, and somewhere between counting the lines in the plaster and listening to the faint sounds of Emma moving around in the hallway, my phone buzzed with another call, this one from my sister, and I remembered with a jolt that my dad had gone in for some tests that morning, tests we were all worried about, and for a 6 second I wondered which part of my life was about to tighten the vice next. When I answered, her voice was already brittle around the edges as she told me there were complications, that the doctors were concerned, that the next few weeks were going to be rough. And as I murmured the right questions and promised to come by the hospital the next day, I felt this heavy, sinking sense that the universe had decided I didn't have enough on my plate and was now bringing out the main course. I don't remember exactly when I started crying that night, only that at some point the tears just showed up, silent and hot, sliding into my ears as I stared at nothing. And it wasn't just about Emma or the house or Luke or the bank accounts. It was about all of it at once, the whole messy pile. And the sudden understanding that in the span of 12 hours, I'd lost not just the person I thought I was married to, but also the version of myself I thought I was, and there was no way to go back to not knowing. The morning after the revelation, I left the house before Emma woke up, which felt like a small victory even though it wasn't one, and drove straight to the bank thinking in this half-panicked, half-practical way that if I could just block the right accounts or freeze the right transfers, I could at least stop the bleeding. The guy at the branch, all polite efficiency and sympathetic eyebrows, walked me through security questions and forms and explained in careful terms that because many of the accounts in question were joint, and because the large transfers had technically been authorized through the bank's existing digital channels, unwinding them was going to be complicated, which was his professional way of saying I shouldn't get my hopes up. From there I went to a lawyer referred by a coworker who had been through a divorce the year before, a sharp woman named Patel who listened quietly as I laid out the situation, stopping only now and then to clarify dates or numbers, and when I finished she said something that startled me with how calm it was. You're not the first person to walk in here with this story, Daniel. You just have bigger numbers than most. We filed what we could file. Petitions to freeze assets, notices of potential fraud on the digital signatures, preliminary divorce papers because according to her there was no point pretending we weren't headed there, and each document I signed felt like walking one more step down a road I hadn't thought I'd ever go near, let alone sprint along. But I told myself that action was better than paralysis, that doing something, anything, would make me feel less like a victim and more like someone steering his own car again. Then reality, as it tends to do, started piling on. My dad's condition worsened. The test results came back ugly. Words like aggressive and limited options getting thrown around by doctors who had perfected that professional mix of delivery and distance. And my sister, who had always been the steady one, started sounding frayed on the phone, asking things like, "Can you handle more of his paperwork? I've got the kids and work and I'm drowning here." And of course I said yes, because what else are you going to say when your father is staring down his last chapter and your sister is already carrying more weight than you? Trying to juggle hospital visits, my own job, and the early stages of divorce proceedings felt like trying to play chess during an earthquake. Everything kept shifting, priorities changed by the hour, and any time I thought I'd managed to stabilize one piece of my life, another one slid off the board. My boss called me into his office one Thursday and said, in that measured tone that always precedes bad news, that my performance had dipped noticeably, that I seemed distracted, that while he understood things at home were tough, the company still needed me to show up fully, and I nodded and agreed and made promises I wasn't sure I could keep, because the alternative was adding unemployment to the pile, and I wasn't sure my shoulders could take that extra weight. Meanwhile, Emma did what Emma does best when backed into a corner. She organized. She hired her own lawyer, a smooth guy named Klein with a good haircut and a smile that never quite reached his eyes, and suddenly what had felt like a storm inside our house turned into official motions and discovery requests and hearing dates. Our whole broken marriage translated into legalese and scheduled arguments. She moved in and out of the house in a pattern I never fully understood, sometimes staying there, sometimes at a friend's, which was probably code for Luke's place or the mansion, depending on where in the process they were, and each time I swung by to grab mail or check on things, the house looked a little less like mine. Objects shifting, drawers half empty, the air carrying a faint, unfamiliar cologne under the usual laundry detergent smell. My first real attempt to push back in a way that felt like it might matter came about 3 weeks in, when Patel and I got enough of the paperwork to see the full trail of money heading toward the house. Armed with that, we went to court to ask for an injunction to halt any further transfers or improvements on the property until we could prove the signatures were forged and the funds misused, and I sat there at the petitioner's table in my only good suit, heart pounding, watching Emma take a seat across the aisle next to Klein, looking smaller than usual but composed, her hair pulled back, her eyes flicking toward me once before shifting to some neutral point in the middle distance. The hearing itself was a blur of procedural language and arguments that, to me, were obviously in my favor. My signature had been copied, my consent assumed, huge sums moved without my knowledge. But the judge, a tired-looking man with deep lines around his mouth, seemed more interested in the fact that the accounts had been joint, and that Emma and I had a long-established pattern of her handling our finances, which meant, in his view, that untangling intent and authorization was not as simple as I wanted it to be. He denied the injunction, saying we could revisit after full discovery, which in practice meant the house project could continue rolling along while my objections sat in paperwork purgatory. Walking out of that courtroom felt like walking out of a rigged game. Klein gave me this professional nod that might as well have been a smirk, and Emma didn't meet my eyes at all, just walked down the hall beside him like they'd been a team for years. And I remember thinking that if there had ever been a moment to turn around, to decide I was done fighting, that might have been it. Because whatever I was doing wasn't stopping them, it was just exhausting me. Then Luke showed up. I first saw him again a few days after that hearing, in the hospital parking lot of all places. I was walking back to my car after a brutal visit where Dad had drifted in and out of morphine-induced sleep, his hand gripping mine with surprising strength every time he surfaced, and I spotted a familiar truck parked under a tree near the entrance, one I recognized instantly from the months it had sat outside our house during the kitchen renovation. He was leaning against the driver's side door, scrolling through his phone, wearing that same casual uniform of worn jeans and a fitted t-shirt, and for a second I thought maybe I was just seeing patterns, that there had to be 100 guys with the same truck and the same general look, but then he glanced up and our eyes met, and there was no mistaking the recognition, or the flicker of discomfort that crossed his face before he pushed it down and straightened up. "Daniel, hey man," he said, like we'd just bumped into each other in the hardware store, not in the shadow of the building where my father was dying, and his affair partner's husband was trying to hold it together, and he shoved his phone into his pocket with a casualness that felt a little too practiced. I asked him what the hell he was doing there, my voice a little rougher than I meant it to be. And he shrugged and said he was doing some work on the hospital's 3rd floor, some subcontracting job, and then, because I'm not great at letting things slide when I'm already raw, I said, "You doing any work over at Brookstone Hills these days?" and watched his jaw tighten just enough to let me know the question had landed. He looked at me for a long moment, then gave this half-smile that I would have once called charming, and now just saw as smug, and he said, "Business is business, Daniel. People hire me to build things. That's what I do, but I get that this is all weird for you, man, and I don't want any trouble between us," like he hadn't already detonated trouble all over my life. I wanted to hit him. The urge was so strong it startled me, my hand actually curling into a fist at my side, but then I pictured my dad upstairs, the beeping monitors, the fragile line between his heartbeat and the flat silence that could come any day, and I forced myself to let it go because the last thing I needed was to add assault charge to my list of issues, and I just said, "You have no idea what you've done," which I knew was a lie because he absolutely did, and he knew that I knew. From that point on, it felt like Luke was everywhere and nowhere at once. His company logo popped up in photos Emma's mutual friends posted of exciting renovation projects. His truck appeared in the background of shots of the mansion's driveway, and each little reminder that he was not only still around but thriving dug into my brain like splinters I couldn't pull out. I hired a private investigator with the last of my bonus money, a guy named Harris who talked like every tired detective in every movie you've ever seen, and set him the task of digging up anything he could on Luke's business and finances, because if I couldn't beat them in court yet, maybe I could at least slow down their little dream project by pointing a few regulatory guns their way. In the meantime, Emma and I tried to talk like civilized people every now and then, usually over coffee at a neutral cafe because she claimed meeting at the house made her feel cornered, which was ironic considering, and those conversations were some of the strangest I've ever had. We could slide from discussing our lawyer's latest emails to exchanging updates on my dad's condition, to arguing about who got the cast iron pan set we'd bought on our 3rd anniversary, all in the space of 20 minutes, like we were 2 co-workers dividing up a shared office instead of 2 people dismantling a family. She never apologized in a way that felt satisfying. There were phrases like, "I never meant to hurt you this much, and I didn't know how to tell you once it got this far." But they were always wrapped in subtle accusations about my emotional distance, my long hours, my tendency to disappear into my phone in the evenings, as if the affair in the house and the lies were some inevitable response to my imperfections. And every time I tried to push back, she'd say something like, "We can't change what's already happened, Daniel. We can only decide how we move forward," which sounded wise and adult until you remembered that what's already happened included her building a whole parallel future with another man. The private investigator finally came back with something after a month, and for a brief, wild moment I thought I'd found my leverage. He sat across from me at a diner, sliding a manila folder across the table like a cliché, and inside were notes and printouts and a few grainy photos of Luke meeting with men Harris described as questionable, along with records of late permit filings, unlicensed subcontractors, some tax irregularities, and rumors of shoddy work on a couple of jobs that had never made it to court but had left some homeowners furious. It was dirt, sure, but it wasn't exactly the kind of clean smoking gun that would allow me to waltz into court and declare the entire house purchase invalid on the grounds that the contractor was a shady bastard. Still, I was desperate enough to try, and Patel agreed to file some supplemental motions, attaching what we could, hinting at possible broader fraud, hoping we might at least convince the judge to slow things down, to look harder at who Emma had chosen to tie our financial future to. The judge was unmoved. He listened. He asked a few pointed questions, he made notes, and then he ruled, yet again, that while these concerns might be relevant in separate proceedings about contractor licensing or taxation, they didn't at this juncture materially alter the marital property issues before him. In plain English, he was basically saying that whether Luke was a choirboy or a crook had no immediate bearing on whether Emma and I were stuck with the house and the debt, and once more I walked out of that courtroom feeling like I'd brought a knife to a gunfight and had it taken away at the door. Not long after that, my dad died. There's no poetic way to put it. One day he was there, frail but stubborn, cracking a weak joke about hospital food and telling me not to worry about his old pickup because it would probably outlive all of us. And the next he was gone. The call coming in just after midnight from a nurse with a kind voice and similar phrases about peaceful and no suffering at the end, which is supposed to be comforting but mostly just sounds like they're trying to sell you a better version of a product you never wanted to buy. The days that followed were a blur of arrangements and relatives and casseroles and paperwork, and in the middle of it all I stood by his casket and thought about how he'd stayed with my mother through 35 years of marriage that included layoffs and miscarriages and her long, painful battle with cancer, how he'd been flawed and sometimes distant but always there, a constant, and how somewhere along the line I'd assumed, without ever saying it out loud, that my life would follow some similar pattern of perseverance and compromise and ordinary loyalty, not whatever the hell this was. Emma came to the funeral, wearing a simple black dress, her hair pulled back, no jewelry except the thin gold bracelet my mom had given her years ago. She hugged my sister, kissed me on the cheek, and sat in the second row with her hands folded neatly in her lap. And if you'd only seen that day, you might have thought she was still my wife. In the old sense of the word, not the woman who'd turned our shared accounts into a down payment on a home I would probably never set foot in. We didn't talk much, just a few brief exchanges about how I was holding up and whether I needed anything. And when she left, sliding into the passenger seat of Luke's truck in the parking lot where I stood smoking a cigarette I'd bummed from my cousin, something in me sagged, like a rope that had been pulled taut for months, finally giving way. I stubbed out the cigarette, squared my shoulders, and realized with a kind of dull clarity that I had never felt more beaten in my life. That night, alone in the small apartment I'd rented after moving out of Mark's place, surrounded by boxes I hadn't bothered to unpack yet, I poured myself a drink, then another, and stared at the wall until the room blurred, thinking about the chain of events that had led me here. A phone call about a house I didn't buy, a confession I never wanted to hear, a series of legal losses, a father's death, and somewhere between the third and fourth drink I caught myself thinking, very calmly, that there was no point in fighting anymore, that maybe the smart move would be to sign whatever papers they put in front of me, walk away from the house, the marriage, the whole mess, and start over somewhere far away with a smaller life and fewer illusions. The burst out of revenge, which had been pulsing like a hot coal in the back of my mind for weeks, seemed suddenly childish and distant, like something a younger, less tired man would fantasize about. What good would it do really to drag them down with me, to keep clawing at a situation that had already taken so much, and who would I even be at the end of that path, assuming I didn't destroy myself in the process? It was a low point, lower than I'd been willing to admit even to myself, and if you'd asked me then what I was going to do next, I probably would have said nothing, because it felt like every attempt to act had only made things worse, and I was running out of energy, out of hope, and, honestly, out of reasons to keep swinging. That was the night before I met the person who would turn all of it upside down. Her name was Rachel, and the first time I saw her, she was standing outside the very mansion that had blown my life apart, staring at it like she wanted to set it on fire just by looking hard enough. Which, given what I'd already been through, was about the most intriguing thing I'd seen in months. I hadn't planned to go to the house that day. I was driving aimlessly, one of those pointless Sunday drives you take when your apartment is too quiet and your thoughts are too loud. And I realized I was only a few turns away from Brookstone Hills, a neighborhood I'd never had reason to pass through before this whole mess, so maybe it was curiosity or masochism, or both, that made me take the right turn instead of the left and follow the winding road up to Crestview Lane. The place looked like something out of a magazine, even half-finished. Big white facade, wide stone steps, tall windows staring down at the street, like eyes that already knew they owned everything they could see. And in the driveway, amid ladders and sawhorses and scattered construction materials, stood a woman, in jeans and a dark jacket, arms folded, jaw set, as unmoving as the pillars beside the front door. I parked a little way down, telling myself I was just going to sit there and look from a distance, like maybe the sight of the dream house my money had helped purchase would finally burn the last traces of it out of my system. But then she turned her head slightly, and I saw her face in profile, and there was something in her expression. Anger, yes, but also a kind of deep, tired sorrow that hit a chord I recognized from my own reflection. Before I knew exactly why, I got out of the car and walked up the sidewalk, feeling exposed and foolish, and when she turned fully to face me, I saw she was older than me by a few years, maybe, with dark hair pulled into a low ponytail and sharp, intelligent eyes that assessed me in one quick sweep, like she was used to sorting situations fast. "If you're with him, you can tell him I'm done playing nice," she said before I could even open my mouth, her voice flat but vibrating underneath. And it took me a second to realize that him meant Luke, because in her world, apparently, he was the gravitational center things revolved around, too. "I'm not with him," I said, and my voice came out more tired than defensive, which seemed to surprise her. "I'm Daniel. I'm the idiot whose wife bought this place with my money." There was a pause, a flicker of something like recognition in her eyes, and then she let out a short, humorless laugh. "Of course you are," she said. "I've been hearing about you for months without a face to put to the name. I'm Rachel. I'm his ex-wife." That stopped me. I'd known, in an abstract way, that Luke had been married before. They'd mentioned an ex in passing when he was working on our kitchen, but I'd never thought about her as a real person with a current address and opinions about the situation I was in, and now here she was standing in the driveway of the house that linked all four of us together, whether we liked it or not. We ended up sitting on the front steps because there was nowhere else clean to sit. The porch still half covered in dust and paint cans, and we traded stories like veterans swapping war tales. I told her about the phone call, the forged signature, the court losses, my dad's decline and death, the nights in the guest room, and then on borrowed couches, and finally in a rented apartment. The exhausting sense that every effort I made to claw something back just sank me deeper. She listened without interrupting much, nodding in the right places, her jaw tightening when I mentioned certain details, and when I finished, she let out a slow breath and said, "He's doing the same thing again, just bigger this time." And if I'd been less wrung out, I might have missed the significance layered into that sentence. "Again," I repeated, and she nodded. "Luke doesn't build houses for people," she said, staring at the double front doors like they'd personally offended her. "He builds illusions for himself. When we were together, it was smaller scale, but the pattern was there. He'd find someone with money or credit, convince them they were lucky to have him on their side, spin big talk about investments and flips and how we could all win. And then, when the dust settled, he always seemed to land on his feet, while the other person was left holding more of the bag than they thought." She told me about the first house they'd shared, how he'd used her inheritance as seed money for a renovation project that had gone sideways when he cut corners to save cash, how they'd ended up in court with the city over code violations, how he'd signed paperwork with her name on it without fully explaining what it meant, how she'd discovered, almost too late, that she was personally liable for debts she hadn't agreed to, but by then it had been easier to sell, cut losses, and leave than try to untangle every messed-up thread. "I thought I was done with him when I divorced him," she said, a bitter little smile ghosting across her face. "But guys like Luke don't go away. They just shift their focus to whoever's easiest to convince next. I didn't know about your wife until a friend of mine mentioned his company working on a big project out here. Said he'd seen Luke with a woman who looked like she had money and no idea what she was getting into. I did some digging, put the pieces together, and here we are. What struck me then, more than the details, was the tone. She wasn't gloating, wasn't saying I told you so, because she hadn't told me anything until now, and she clearly didn't enjoy being right about him. She just sounded tired, like someone who'd watched the same bad movie too many times and knew all the lines. We talked for a long time, long enough that the light shifted and the shadows from the trees in the yard lengthened across the lawn. And somewhere in that conversation, a shift happened inside me. Up until then, I'd thought of Emma as the sole architect of my disaster, and Luke as a sort of human wrecking ball she'd hired. But hearing Rachel lay out the pattern, seeing how he'd worked her and others before, I started to see Emma in a slightly different light. Not as innocent, not by a long shot, but as someone who might have been targeted at just the right vulnerable moment and seduced not just by the man, but by the story he told about what life could look like with him. That realization did not erase my anger or my hurt, but it complicated it, gave it new dimensions, and in a weird way, that complexity made me feel a little less hopeless, because it meant the situation wasn't just a clean line from Emma's betrayal to my pain. There were angles, leverage points, other hands in the mix. Rachel, for her part, had been doing her own digging. She had copies of some old contracts Luke had used, emails he'd sent to investors that didn't line up with the official numbers he'd reported later, and a few recordings he didn't know she had from the tail end of their marriage, when she'd started saving receipts not out of spite, but self-defense. None of it, on its own, was enough to bring him down, she said, but taken together and combined with what I knew about the mansion finances, it painted a picture of a man who liked to play fast and loose with other people's money and assumed he'd never be held accountable. "Why are you telling me all this?" I asked at one point, genuinely curious because ex-spouses don't usually go out of their way to get involved in each other's new messes, especially when it involves new partners and houses they're not invited to, and she looked at me with this clear, level gaze and said, "Because I'm tired of watching him walk away from wreckage like he's the hero of the story, and because you're the first one I've seen who might actually care enough to do something about it besides just lick your wounds and move on." It was the first time in months anyone had suggested I might be capable of something other than losing. We started meeting regularly after that, usually in neutral spots, a coffee shop halfway between my apartment and her condo, a quiet corner of the park, once or twice in my car outside. The house when she'd heard there was a big delivery scheduled, and we compared notes like we were building a case, which, in a way, we were. I shared what the private investigator had found, the financial statements Patel had pulled from Discovery, the house purchase documents with their suspiciously neat digital signatures. She brought in her old files, her memories, her insights into how Luke thought and how he liked to present himself. As we talked, a rough picture emerged of Luke's bigger strategy. He found financially stable partners, romantic or otherwise, talked them into ambitious projects with just enough truth to be believable, used their credit and assets as the foundation while presenting himself as the indispensable expert, then siphoned off money along the way through overbilling, side deals with subcontractors, and quietly inflated budgets. When things went well, he acted like a genius. When they didn't, he always had a story about unexpected costs or market dips or bureaucratic red tape, and somehow the other person usually ended up shouldering most of the fallout. What made the mansion different and more dangerous for me was the scale. $2 million plus wasn't just a bad investment, it was potentially life-ruining debt if things went sideways, and the more we dug, the more I realized that while the title and loans were technically in both my and Emma's names, Luke had maneuvered himself into a position where he could walk away with far less personal damage if the project collapsed. The big turning point came when Rachel showed me an email chain she'd managed to get from a mutual acquaintance who'd done some bookkeeping for Luke on the side. In it, Luke was discussing options. If the Brookstone project went over budget, casually mentioning the possibility of letting the owners take the hit if necessary and transitioning assets to a different LLC he controlled, language that was vague enough to pass casual scrutiny but clear enough to anyone reading between the lines that he wasn't planning on going down with the ship. Patel's eyes lit up when she read that chain, and for the first time since this all began, I saw something like genuine optimism on my lawyer's face. Combined with the financial inconsistencies we'd already flagged and Rachel's documentation of past similar behavior, we finally had the makings of something more than just a messy marital dispute. "This is bigger than divorce court now," Patel said, tapping the pages with her pen. "If we can corroborate this with a few more solid pieces, we're looking at potential fraud, maybe even criminal charges. At the very least, we can bring enough pressure that the other side will have to rethink how hard they want to push back. The idea of Luke facing actual legal consequences made something sharp and hungry stir in my chest, but alongside that rising sense of vindication was something more complicated when it came to Emma. If we went down this road hard, she might get caught up in it too, depending on how the prosecutors decided to view her role. Was she a co-conspirator, a gullible accomplice, a victim, or some messy combination of all three? I didn't have an answer, and I wasn't sure I wanted to admit that part of me still cared what happened to her, even after everything. But the question was there now, floating above every strategy discussion like a little storm cloud. How much collateral damage was I willing to tolerate in the name of payback? Then came the night that forced the issue. It was late, the kind of late where even the busiest streets start looking empty. And I was at my place going through yet another stack of emails when there was a knock on my apartment door. For a moment I considered ignoring it, assuming it was a neighbor or some delivery gone wrong. But the knocking came again, more insistent, and there was something familiar in the rhythm that made my stomach tighten. When I opened the door, Emma was standing there, hood up against the light rain outside, eyes rimmed red like she hadn't slept or had cried recently, or both. She didn't wait for an invitation, just brushed past me into the tiny living room, looking around like she was trying to reconcile this cramped space with whatever version of me still lived in her memory. "This is where you're living now," she said, not unkindly, just surprised, and I told her it was temporary, which was true in the sense that I didn't plan to die there, but not in any optimistic way. "What do you want, Emma?" I asked, because I was too tired for small talk, and she turned to face me fully, pulling her hood down, and for the first time in a while I saw the woman I'd married shining through the person I'd been fighting. She looked scared, and not in the abstract worried about lawyer sense, but in the way someone looks when a fire they thought they could control has jumped to the next building. "I think I made a mistake," she said, and I almost laughed because that sentence didn't even begin to cover it, but something in her tone made me hold back. "With the house. With Luke." She went on to tell me that the project was spiraling. Costs were ballooning beyond even the inflated numbers Luke had projected. Subcontractors were complaining about delays in payment. Her name kept popping up in emails from banks and city offices she didn't remember authorizing. And whenever she pressed Luke for details, he gave her vague reassurances and platitudes about short-term pain for long-term gain, telling her she worried too much and needed to trust the process. The breaking point, she said, had come earlier that day, when she'd stumbled onto an email thread between Luke and one of his buddies, the kind of half-serious, half-bragging conversation guys have when they think nobody's going to see it. In it, Luke joked about finally landing a sucker with real assets and building my dream palace on someone else's dime, followed by a string of crude remarks about rich but desperate women. And while he hadn't mentioned her by name, the timing and the context were clear enough that even she couldn't rationalize it away. "I thought we were in this together," she said, her voice cracking in a way that might have moved me more months earlier. "I thought he loved me, that this house was our future, not just some scheme. I know I screwed up with you. I know I lied and cheated, and I don't deserve your sympathy, but I don't know what to do now. If this goes bad, they're going to come after both of us, and he'll be long gone by then." There it was, laid bare. The fear that had been creeping up on her the whole time, while she'd been playing the part of the bold investor and the woman bravely choosing happiness over convention. The story she'd told herself about her affair in the mansion was collapsing under the weight of reality, and she was running out of places to hide from that collapse. I should have felt vindicated. Part of me did, in a way that was darkly satisfying, like watching a bully trip over his own feet. But there was also a deeper, quieter part of me that recognized the look in her eyes from my own mirror, the sinking realization that the thing you bet everything on is about to fall apart, and there's no clean way to step aside without getting hit by the debris. I told her, carefully, that I'd already been working with someone on Luke's past behavior, that we might have enough to get real authorities interested. Not just divorce lawyers, and for a moment she just stared at me, processing that my anger had not been limited to hurt feelings and frozen accounts, that while she and Luke had been painting walls and picking fixtures, I'd been quietly assembling a case. "Who?" she asked, and when I said Rachel's name, she blinked, surprised. "You're working with his ex," she said, and then this odd expression crossed her face, something between shame and respect, as if she was realizing just how much she'd underestimated my capacity to respond to what she'd done. We talked for a long time that night, longer than I would have thought possible given the damage between us. We went back over the house paperwork, the texts she'd saved, the conversations she'd had with Luke about shifting money around, the times he'd insisted on handling certain calls himself. She handed me her phone, let me scroll through messages where he'd nudged her to, "Oh, just sign it. Babe, I've got the rest." And with each piece of information, the picture Patel had been building sharpened in my mind. At some point, well past midnight, as the rain intensified outside and the world narrowed to the small circle of light from the lamp between us, Emma asked the question I'd known was coming. If this turns into a legal case against him, what happens to me? I didn't have a complete answer, and I told her so, because if there was one thing I was done with, it was pretending certainty where there wasn't any. It depends, I said, on how the prosecutors see it, on how much you cooperate, on whether they think you were in on it from the start or got pulled in deeper than you understood. And what do you think? She asked, and I hesitated, because the easy thing would have been to say I thought she was just as guilty and deserved whatever she got, but the truth was more complicated, and I knew it. I think you knew you were doing something wrong with me, I said slowly. You lied, you cheated, you stole, and you justified it to yourself in 100 ways. But I also think he targeted you when you were vulnerable, and he fed you exactly the story you needed to hear. And that doesn't erase your responsibility, but it does change the shape of it. Whether that matters in court, I don't know. Whether it matters to me? I trailed off because I wasn't ready to finish that sentence. She nodded, accepting that non-answer, and after a while she left, pulling her hood up again, disappearing into the rain, leaving behind the faint smell of her shampoo in my apartment, and 1,000 questions in my head about what I was willing to do next, not just to Luke, but to her. The next day, sitting in Patel's office with Rachel on speakerphone and Emma's new trove of messages and documents spread out on the desk between us, it became clear that we were at a crossroads. We had enough now to go to the authorities with a compelling narrative of financial manipulation and potential fraud, especially if Emma was willing to testify about Luke's behavior, but we also knew that doing so would almost certainly blow up whatever remained of my and Emma's financial stability in the short term, tie her up in criminal investigations, and guarantee that the saga of the mansion would be public, messy, and long. Once we pull this trigger, there's no putting the bullet back in the gun, Patel said in her characteristically blunt way. You need to be very sure this is the direction you want to go, because even if it leads to some justice in the end, it won't be quick and it won't be clean. I looked at the documents, at Emma's panicked texts on the printouts, at the printed emails where Luke treated me and her like characters in a game he was winning, at Rachel's notes about similar patterns years before, and I felt something inside me harden into a kind of grim resolve. For months I'd been reacting, absorbing blows, trying and failing to stop the damage. But now, for the first time, there was a chance to do more than just defend myself. It was also the first time it really sank in that whatever we did next would not just hurt the man who'd helped wreck my marriage, it would also pull down parts of the life I'd once shared with Emma, and maybe even parts of whatever life she thought she was building now. That was the great truth I learned at the end of that act. Revenge, in the real world, doesn't come in clean, surgical strikes. It arrives like a wave, and it does not care who else gets knocked off their feet in the surf. If the earlier parts of this story felt like being pushed around on a chessboard, Act 4 was the moment I finally picked up a piece with the intention of swinging it like a weapon instead of placing it where I was told. It was the period where every choice came with consequences I couldn't fully predict, and where I discovered that the strength people talk about in these situations isn't some heroic blaze of courage, but a stubborn refusal to let go of what you've decided is right, even when it costs you more than you thought you could afford. We decided to move forward. Patel filed detailed complaints with the state attorney general's office and the district attorney in the county where the house was located, complete with supporting documentation from Rachel's history, Emma's messages, the financial inconsistencies, and Luke's own words from the email chains we'd obtained. Emma, to her credit, agreed to sign a sworn statement outlining her experiences, admitting her own wrongdoing in the process, which I knew had to terrify her, and Rachel added her own account from years earlier, showing the pattern. The response was not immediate. The wheels of official justice turn, slowly, at the best of times, and for a while it felt like we'd thrown a grenade into a canyon and were waiting, endlessly, for the echo. Divorce court continued its plodding path. The mansion renovation pushed forward, though more erratically now, and my bank accounts remained a tangle of frozen funds, partial payments, and legal fees that continued to bleed me even as I tried to hold the line. Then, one afternoon, Patel called me with a tone in her voice I hadn't heard before, a mix of satisfaction and caution. "They're interested," she said. "The DA's office wants to meet. They've been looking at some other complaints about Luke and his company. Smaller stuff mostly, but combined with what we brought them, they think there's enough smoke to start looking seriously for fire." The idea that Luke might actually face criminal charges put a hard, steady energy in my veins. But it also made everything feel much more real, more dangerous. This wasn't just about me reclaiming some money or dignity anymore, it was about setting in motion something that could end in prison time, reputations destroyed, livelihoods wiped out. I had to decide, really decide, whether I wanted that on my conscience, not just in the abstract revenge fantasy way, but in the actual sense of watching someone hauled away in handcuffs because of a process I'd helped start. The DA's investigators were not like the lawyers I'd been dealing with. They were less interested in my feelings and more interested in my facts. They asked precise questions about dates, amounts, conversations, who had said what and when. They took copies of everything, asked me to recount the evolution of the house deal from my perspective, and seemed particularly interested in the ways Luke had represented himself to Emma and to the banks versus the reality of his financial situation. They also pointedly asked about Emma's role, and I watched them weigh her actions not as my estranged wife, but as a potential witness or suspect, flipping mental switches in categories I had no control over. When they called her in separately later, I knew she was walking into a room where the story she told could determine not just Luke's future, but her own. And the weight of that sat heavy on my chest, even as I reminded myself that she had chosen to be part of this long before I chose to fight back. At the same time all this was happening, the divorce case crept toward a settlement negotiating phase, which meant I had to juggle two overlapping but not identical goals. Protect myself financially and legally in the eyes of the family court, and support the DA's investigation in a way that maximized their chances of building a strong case without completely obliterating my own chances of rebuilding anything once the dust settled. It was in that messy overlap that I found my real test. One evening, as the sun was going down and the city outside my apartment window glowed in, that washed-out orange way that makes everything look more dramatic than it is, I found myself in Patel's office again, staring at a draft of a proposed settlement agreement from Klein. It offered me a slightly larger share of some of our remaining joint investments and retirement accounts than I'd expected, plus a clean break from the mansion's ongoing costs in exchange for my signing a clause stating that I did not believe Emma had engaged in any intentional wrongdoing regarding the house purchase, and agreeing not to pursue any further civil claims against her related to it. "Let me guess," I said, tapping the clause with my finger. "They want something they can wave in front of a jury later that says even the ex-husband doesn't think she did anything on purpose. So she looks more like a victim than a co-conspirator." Patel nodded. "That's probably part of it," she said. "From a divorce perspective, it's not a terrible deal given where we are. From a broader justice perspective, it's a trade. They're essentially offering you a bit of money and distance from the house in exchange for weakening your leverage over her and potentially over him if the prosecutors decide her complicity is a key piece of their case." I sat back, my mind spinning. On one side was a vision of myself in a year or two, slightly less broke, fully disentangled from the mansion, able to tell myself I'd salvaged what I could and walked away like a rational adult. On the other side was something messier and more uncertain. The possibility of playing a role in finally stopping a man who treated other people's trust like currency to be spent, even if it meant keeping my own wounds open longer and risking collateral damage to someone I had loved, even if I didn't like her much at the moment. Coming to that crossroads, I realized, was where all the talk about revenge became something else, something heavier and more moral than the satisfying fantasies I'd entertained drunk at 2 a.m. This wasn't about getting even in some simple, satisfying way. It was about choosing which values I was going to prioritize when there was no option that didn't hurt. That night, after leaving Patel's office, I went for a long walk, the kind where you don't pay attention to the streets you're turning down until you realize you've gone much farther than you meant to. I thought about my dad. About the way he talked about doing the right thing as something you do because you have to live with yourself afterward, not because it guarantees a good outcome. And I thought about the younger version of me who had believed that being a good husband and working hard and paying bills on time would shield him from this kind of mess. Eventually, my feet brought me to a small park where Rachel and I had met a few times. She was there, by coincidence or fate, or just because her life had its own patterns, sitting on a bench, under a tree, flipping through something on her phone. And when she saw me, she smiled that tired, knowing smile she'd perfected over our months of reluctant alliance. I told her about the settlement offer, about the clause, about my dilemma, and she listened quietly, letting me spill it all out without jumping in. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, then said, "No one can make this choice for you, Daniel. You've already lost a lot. Wanting to cut your losses and get out doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. But if you do decide to keep pushing, to not sign, you need to be really clear with yourself about why, because the path is going to get uglier before it gets cleaner." "What would you do?" I asked, even though I knew she'd just told me that was the wrong question, and she sighed. If I were you, knowing what I know about him, I'd want him stopped, she said. Not just for your sake or mine or Emma's, but for the next person down the line, the next woman he charms, the next investor he sweet talks. But I also don't have to live with the immediate fallout of your choice. I've already walked away from my version of this mess. You're still in the middle of yours. I went home more conflicted than ever, the weight of the decision pressing on my chest like someone sitting there. At 3 in the morning, unable to sleep, I found myself scrolling through old photos on my phone. Emma and me at our wedding, my dad in the backyard grilling burgers, Luke in our half-finished kitchen, smiling at the camera with a hammer in his hand, Rachel in a group shot from some community fundraiser I didn't remember being at but apparently had attended. Looking at those frozen slices of time, it hit me that every person in them had made choices that led to this point. Some selfish, some careless, some well-intentioned and doomed. I couldn't untangle those choices or assign neat percentages of blame, but I could decide what kind of man I wanted to be. In response, and as corny as it sounds, that realization snapped something into place. The next day I told Patel I wasn't signing. We'll counter on the financial terms without that clause, I said. If they want me to say Emma never did anything intentionally wrong, they can try to convince a judge or a jury of that without my help. I'm not going to lie for her, and I'm not going to soften things for him just to get a slightly better slice of a pie he baked with my ingredients. It wasn't a noble speech by any means, and it wasn't born from pure altruism. My stubbornness and my anger were still very much in the mix, but it was the closest thing to a conscious moral choice I'd made in months, and once I'd said it out loud, I felt an odd kind of peace settle in, alongside the anxiety. Things escalated after that. The DA's office formally opened an investigation into Luke and his company, subpoenaing records, interviewing former clients, and eventually bringing him in for questioning. He tried to play it cool from what I heard, presenting himself as a hard-working small business owner unfairly targeted by disgruntled ex-partners and bitter ex-spouses, but the paper trail didn't care about his charm, and every new document turned up seemed to back up what we'd been saying all along. Emma was called in multiple times as a witness, and although I wasn't present for most of it, I knew from the updates Patel relayed and the hollow look in Emma's eyes when I occasionally ran into her at some courthouse or hallway that it was grueling, that telling the truth about what she'd done, and what she'd allowed to be done through her, felt like peeling off her own skin in front of strangers. I won't pretend I didn't feel some grim satisfaction in that. Part of me believed, and still believes, that facing the consequences of our choices is how we grow. And she had spent months insisting on a version of events where her only mistake was falling for the wrong person, not betraying the right one. But there were nights when I lay awake and pictured her alone in her new place, reading legal notices and worrying about her future, and the pity that flickered through me made me wonder what kind of fool I still was on some level. Luke, predictably, grew more hostile as the pressure mounted. He sent me a few late-night texts that ranged from threats to pleading, accusing me of trying to ruin his life, calling me every name in the book, and at one point implying that if I didn't back off, he'd make sure everyone knows what kind of psycho-stalker I was. I forwarded everything to Patel and the investigators and otherwise ignored him, because by then I understood that attention, even in the form of arguments, was something he fed on, and I was done feeding him directly. The climax of this whole stretch came the day the DA's office executed a search warrant on Luke's office and the mansion itself. I wasn't there, obviously, but Rachel was, parked a discreet distance away, watching as unmarked cars pulled up and people in windbreakers started carrying boxes out. She texted me updates in real time, each ping another reminder that the consequences we'd set in motion were no longer theoretical. That night, the news ran a brief segment about a local contractor under investigation for alleged financial misconduct. And while they didn't name Emma or me, anyone who knew us and knew about the house could connect some dots. My phone lit up with curious, half-polite messages from acquaintances, and my sister called asking if I was okay, if this would mean more court, more stress, more delay in the whole divorce wrapping up. And I told her the truth. Yes, probably, but also that for the first time in a long while, I felt like maybe all of this pain might eventually mean something beyond just my own misery. Of course, life doesn't pause while you wait for big legal processes to play out. Bills still came, my job still needed my attention. My grief for my father still woke me up some mornings with a sharp ache when I briefly forgot he was gone. The divorce proceeded in parallel. Slower and more contentious now that the mansion and Luke were radioactive, and there were moments when I almost regretted not taking the earlier settlement, not because I wanted to protect Emma or Luke anymore, but because I was simply tired. Tired in my bones, in my soul, in whatever part of me had once thought of the future as anything other than a series of days to get through. But every time I considered backing off, dialing down my cooperation, taking an easier path, I remembered Luke's emails, his casual references to suckers, his arrogant assumption that he'd skate by yet again. And I remembered my dad's hand squeezing mine in the hospital, his voice telling me in one of his clearer moments that you don't let people like that walk all over you or others if you have a choice in the matter. In the end, what kept me going wasn't some grand sense of heroism. It was a combination of stubbornness, anger, and a slowly growing awareness that if I compromised now purely out of fatigue, I'd carry that compromise with me long after the court stopped sending me mail. Like a stone in my shoe I'd never get rid of. The official charges, when they finally came, were a mixture of the expected and the surprising. Multiple counts of fraud, embezzlement related to client funds, tax evasion on some of the side deals he'd thought no one would ever trace, and conspiracy charges that named unindicted co-conspirators in language that could have applied to Emma, but thanks in part to her cooperation and the way the DA chose to frame the narrative, did not formally include her. When I read the indictment, my hands shook. This was it. The culmination of months of digging and deciding and sacrificing, laid out in black and white legal jargon that stripped away all the emotional context and distilled everything down to allegations and counts and statutes, and yet behind every dry phrase I could see the real faces. Rachel's, mine, Emma's, the other clients who'd come forward, all the people who had trusted Luke at one time or another, and paid for it. The night before Luke's arraignment, I sat alone in my apartment and tried to figure out how I felt. Victorious wasn't quite right, because there was nothing clean or joyful about any of this, and even satisfied didn't land properly, because the cost had been so high. But there was a sense of rightness, I guess, a feeling that at least for once, someone who had taken and taken and taken without consequence was finally being called to account. At the same time, I knew this was not the end. Trials can drag on, plea deals can reshape outcomes, people can spin stories to salvage their reputations even when the legal system doesn't fully buy them. And in the middle of all that, Emma and I still had to sign the final divorce papers, still had to go to one last hearing and tell a judge that our marriage was irretrievably broken. A phrase that sounded clinical and insufficient given everything that had transpired, but was the one the system recognized. Standing in that courtroom with her one last time, listening to the judge ask his standard questions, hearing Emma's voice answer in a steady tone that, yes, she believed there was no reasonable chance for reconciliation, I felt a wave of emotions rise and crash through me. Sadness for what we'd once had, anger for what she'd done to it, pity for the way she now looked smaller, diminished by the weight of her own choices and the fallout from ours, and a strange, unexpected tenderness for the dumb, hopeful kids we'd been when we said yes to each other in front of our families. When it was over, when the judge pronounced us legally done, we stepped out into the hallway, and for a moment we just stood there. Two people who had shared a life and a bed and 1,000 mundane routines, now stripped down to signatures on documents and separate futures. I heard they arrested him, she said quietly, eyes fixed on some point on the wall. Yeah, I said. They did. She was silent for a long moment, then said, thank you, I guess, for not throwing me under the bus when you could have. And I almost laughed, because from my perspective, she'd crawled under that bus on her own, months ago. But I knew what she meant. There were points along the way where I could have pressed harder to make sure she was dragged in more formally, and I hadn't, whether out of some lingering care or just a line I couldn't bring myself to cross. I didn't do it for you, I said, and that was true. But I also didn't want one mistake, even a huge one, to define the rest of your life if it didn't have to. You were wrong. He was worse. She nodded, eyes glossy, and then she walked away. Heels clicking down the hallway, turning the corner and disappearing from my line of sight, and just like that, the chapter of my life that had been defined by being Emma's husband ended, not with a bang or a dramatic scene, but with the quiet sound of footsteps fading. I had chosen, in the end, to see this thing through, to throw my weight, such as it was, behind stopping a man who made a sport of using people's trust as leverage. I had protected Emma more than she deserved and less than she probably wanted. I had sacrificed money and sleep and a good chunk of my belief in happy endings, and all that remained was the long, slow work of figuring out who I was on the other side of it. Luke eventually took a plea deal. The DA's office, weighing the costs and uncertainties of a full trial against the evidence and the willingness of witnesses to endure lengthy cross-examination, agreed to a package that included several years in prison, restitution orders to multiple victims, and a long period of probation with strict financial restrictions. To some people, especially those who only knew the broad strokes, it looked like a win. To others, including some of his angriest former clients, it felt like he was still getting off too easy. For me, hearing the terms was a strange cocktail of emotions. On paper, I was entitled to a slice of the restitution pie, some fraction of the money that had vanished into the mansion and related dealings, but the DA warned me it might be years before I saw a cent, if ever, depending on Luke's assets, future income, and the priority order of different claims. In practical terms, my finances were still wrecked. I had downsized my expectations for housing, for retirement, for travel, for the kind of safety net I'd once taken for granted. I kept my job, barely. After a rough patch where my performance had nosedived, I'd managed to claw my way back to something like competent, though the old fire I'd had for moving up the ladder was gone. I wasn't interested in impressing anyone anymore. I just wanted stability, a paycheck, a routine that wasn't built on constant crisis. My boss, to his credit, backed off the micromanaging once it became clear I was leveling out, and my coworkers did that thing people do when they know something big has happened in your life, but don't know how to talk about it. They treaded lightly, offered neutral kindness, and generally let me dictate how much of my story I wanted to share. My relationship with Rachel evolved into something solid and oddly grounding, not romantic, at least not then, but deep. When you go through a war with someone, even if it's a war fought mostly with documents and meetings instead of guns, you end up with a kind of connection that doesn't need constant tending, but also doesn't fade easily. We checked in on each other periodically, traded updates on the legal aftermath, sometimes grabbed coffee just to talk about anything but Luke, reminding ourselves and each other that we had identities beyond the roles we'd played in his story. As for Emma, our contact gradually dwindled to almost nothing. There were occasional texts about lingering practical matters, tax forms, old mail, some distant cousin's wedding invitation one of us had received by mistake, but they were brief, polite, stripped of any emotional content beyond a shared, tacit acknowledgement that we were both survivors of the same disaster. I heard, through mutual acquaintances, that she'd sold whatever interest she had left in the mansion and moved into a smaller place across town, that she'd changed jobs, that she'd started therapy. I didn't ask for details, and she didn't offer any. For a while I tried dating, mostly because people told me I should, that it would be good for me, that I shouldn't let one bad marriage define my belief in relationships, and maybe they were right, but the reality was messy. I found myself comparing new women to Emma without wanting to, scrutinizing their words for hidden meanings, flinching whenever conversations drifted toward money or long-term plans. More than once I caught myself holding back, not because the person in front of me had done anything wrong, but because I was terrified of ever trusting someone that deeply again. Therapy helped, though I resisted it at first. The idea of paying someone to sit and listen while I unraveled felt self-indulgent, and I told myself I was fine, that other people had it worse. Eventually, after one too many sleepless nights and one too many conversations where I heard myself repeating the same complaints like a broken record, I gave in and went. The woman I saw, Dr. Klein, was patient and blunt in a way I came to appreciate. She didn't try to spin what had happened into some grand narrative of growth, but she did push me to move beyond simply cataloging my grievances into actually examining the patterns that had made me vulnerable. We talked about my tendency to avoid conflict until it blew up, about my habit of delegating unpleasant tasks, like finances, to others, and then being shocked when their choices diverged from mine, about my reluctance to ask for help or admit weakness, about the way I'd conflated stability with love and missed warning signs because I didn't want to rock the boat. None of that excused what Emma had done, and she never suggested it did, but it did give me a frame in which I could see myself as something other than just a victim. I had been wronged, yes, but I had also been a participant in my own undoing in smaller, subtler ways. The question of revenge came up a lot in those sessions, usually because I brought it up, circling it like an animal checking a fence. Was what I'd done to Luke revenge, or was it justice? Was there even a meaningful difference? Or was that just a story we tell ourselves to feel better about the things we do when we're hurt? If I had backed off earlier, taken the settlement, walked away, would I be happier now, or would I be haunted by the knowledge that I'd let him keep running his game on the next person? There was no neat answer, which frustrated me at first. I wanted someone to stamp approved or denied on my choices, to tell me I'd done either the righteous thing or the petty one. Instead, Dr. Klein gently steered me toward accepting that my motives had been mixed from the start. I had wanted justice, yes, but I had also wanted him to suffer, to feel some fraction of the fear and helplessness he'd caused. I had wanted to protect potential future victims, but I had also wanted the satisfaction of seeing him lose. Those truths could coexist, even if they made my self-image more complicated. The closest I came to a clear moral dilemma, the kind that doesn't resolve neatly, happened about a year after Luke went to prison. I was sitting in a small cafe not far from my office, nursing a coffee on my lunch break, when I looked up and saw Emma standing in line at the counter, backlit by the window. For a moment I thought about pretending I hadn't seen her, burying my face in my phone until she got her drink and left, but she turned at that moment, our eyes met, and we were both caught. She walked over, hesitated at the edge of my table, and asked in a voice that was steadier than I felt if she could sit. I nodded, and we did the small talk dance for a few minutes. Work, the weather, a mutual friend's new baby. All the neutral topics people reach for when there's an ocean of unsaid things between them. Then she mentioned, almost casually, that she'd been asked to speak at some panel about financial literacy and women's empowerment that a nonprofit was organizing, that they wanted her to share her story anonymously as a cautionary tale about trusting partners too blindly. And she asked, would you be okay with that? As if my blessing would somehow absolve the parts of the story she was choosing to highlight. A part of me bristled. The idea of her recasting herself primarily as a victim, as someone whose lesson was, don't let a man control your finances, conveniently skipping over the fact that she had also controlled mine in ways that nearly ruined me, rubbed me the wrong way. Another part of me, though, saw the potential value. If hearing her talk made one person pause before signing something they didn't understand, or think twice about letting someone like Luke run their bank accounts, maybe it would prevent a wreck like ours. Are you going to tell them all of it? I asked, my tone not accusatory, just genuinely curious. Or just the parts where you were fooled? She looked down at her cup, turning it slowly between her hands. I'm going to tell them I made choices I thought were about taking control of my life and ended up handing it to the wrong person, she said. I'm going to tell them I hurt someone I loved and got hurt in return, and that none of that made the math any less brutal when the bills came due. I'm not going to go into names or the affair or the mansion to that level of detail, because that's not what they're asking for, but I'm not planning to paint myself as blameless either. I believed her mostly because the Emma sitting in front of me now was not the one who'd stood in our kitchen justifying her choices months before. She looked older, not just in the surface ways, but in the set of her shoulders, in the way she chose her words with more care. Do you want my permission? I asked. She shook her head. I want your, I don't know. Your understanding, maybe. Your acceptance that I'm trying to make something productive out of what we went through, even if it's imperfect and self-serving in some ways. I don't know if I have the right to ask that, but I'm asking anyway. There it was. A request that was not strictly necessary, legally or practically, but mattered in that intangible way stories do when more than one person lived them. I could have said no, told her I didn't want her using our mess as material, insisted that she keep it private out of respect for my pain. I could have said yes, enthusiastically, playing the bigger person, the guy who'd risen above and found grace. Instead, I sat there, feeling the weight of the choice, and said the most honest thing I could. I can't tell you how to tell your story. You're going to carry what happened differently than I am, and you get to choose what parts you show people. I don't love the idea of being reduced to an anonymous cautionary example, but if it helps someone, if it helps you, I'm not going to stand in the way. Just don't erase your part in it. Don't make it sound like it all happened to you. Some of it did. Some of it didn't. She nodded, eyes shining a little, and said, that's fair. And we sat there in silence for a minute, letting the clatter of cups and the low murmur of other people's conversations fill the space between us. When we parted, there was no hug, no promise to stay in touch. We just said goodbye, each of us walking back into our separate lives. I don't know, to this day, exactly how she told that story on the panel, whether she tilted it more toward her victimhood or her accountability. I only know that for the first time I didn't feel the need to monitor or control it. That, I think, was when I realized that revenge, in the sense I'd been chasing it, had a built-in expiration date. Beyond a certain point, keeping score stops giving you energy and starts draining it. And the person you're really punishing by replaying everything in your head over and over is yourself. Holding Luke accountable had been necessary. Refusing to lie for Emma had been necessary. But beyond that, the work of my life wasn't going to be about them anymore. It was going to be about what I did with what was left. Sometimes late at night, when the city quiets down and there's nothing left to distract me, I still think about the mansion on Crestview Lane. It never became the dream palace Luke had envisioned. Last I heard, it was sold off in some complicated arrangement to cover debts. Partially finished, a beautiful shell that other hands would complete. I picture it standing there, lights on in new windows, laughter echoing in rooms that never saw Emma's furniture or my photos on the walls, and I wonder if the people living there have any idea what their home cost in terms that don't show up on a closing statement. I think about my dad, too, about what he'd make of all this. Sometimes I imagine telling him the whole story over a beer on the back porch, The phone call, the betrayal, the legal battles, the alliance with Rachel, the choice not to take the easy way out, the mixed motives, the messy aftermath. In those imagined conversations, he doesn't give me a neat moral, doesn't pat me on the back and declare me a hero or shake his head and tell me I went too far. He just listens, like he used to, and says something simple like, "You did the best you could with what you had at the time, kid," which is both comforting and unsatisfying, like most true things. If there's a lesson in all this, and I'm not convinced every story needs one, but people like them, and I've spent enough time in therapy to recognize patterns, it's probably something like this. The line between justice and revenge is thinner than we like to admit, and crossing it doesn't always look like some dramatic act of cruelty. Sometimes it looks like a series of small, reasonable choices made while you're hurt and tired and trying to protect yourself, each one defensible on its own, that add up to a path you wouldn't have chosen in calmer times. Would I do it all again, knowing what I know now? Would I still choose to push for charges, to refuse the settlement, to let Luke's life implode even if it meant living in the rubble of my own for longer? On some days, when the weight of it all sits lighter, when I help my nephew with his homework, or joke with a coworker over bad office coffee, when I pay a bill on time and see my bank balance slowly recover, I think yes, because the thought of Luke still out there running the same game makes my skin crawl. On other days, when I wake from dreams where none of it happened and have to relive the loss all over again, when a small financial emergency sends my anxiety spiking because my safety net is still thin, I hesitate. That's the moral dilemma that lingers. Was the price of making him pay worth what it cost me? And if it wasn't, does that mean I should have done nothing? Or does it just mean that in a world where people hurt each other in big careless ways, there are no good options, only ones you can live with or can't? I don't have a final answer, and I'm learning to be okay with that. Life, as it turns out, keeps moving even when the big dramatic chapters end. There are still dishes to wash, emails to answer, small kindnesses to offer and accept. I am no longer the man who answered that call about a house he didn't buy, thinking he knew the shape of his future, but I'm also not just the man whose wife cheated on him and whose money built a stranger's dream. I'm something in between, something still being built. Maybe that's the closest thing to closure I'm going to get. Not a neat conclusion, but an ongoing question I carry with me, a reminder that the desire to make things even is human, and so is the risk of letting that desire turn you into someone you don't recognize if you're not careful. When I drive past Crestview Lane now, which I sometimes still do, I don't slow down. I don't look for Luke's truck or Emma's car. I don't stare up at the lit windows and imagine alternate lives. I just pass by, another man on another road, heading toward a home that's smaller, humbler, less impressive on paper, but mine, built not on someone else's broken trust, but on the simple, stubborn decision to keep going, even when the story doesn't promise a happy ending, only the chance to write the next page a little more honestly than the last.